This year marks the 30th anniversary of the death of one of the most influential writers of all time. The iconic Philip K. Dick is met. Although virtually unknown outside the circles of science fiction during his lifetime, the intriguing philosophy Dick about the nature of reality has become a staple of modern Hollywood movies. Blockbusters as Total Recall, Minority Report, The Adjustment Bureau, Blade Runner, A Scanner Darkly and Paycheck Handily were based directly of his novels or short stories, and films like The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Memento, The Matrix, The Truman Show and Inception all have a huge debt to his vision. One of the most interesting topics of writing Dick was the concept of precog, a person who could see the future before it happened. In 1954, Phil introduced the concept of precognition in his novel The World Jones Made. In this novel, the eponymous anti-hero Floyd Jones can see exactly 1 year in the future. Thereafter the precogs occur regularly in his novels and short stories, especially in its short history 1956 The Minority Report, his 1964 novel Martian Time Slip, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch and many others. What made Philip K. Dick is interested both in precognition. It had not been a particular issue in the classic science fiction, and has been part of the books that the young Philip read during his childhood and adolescence. The answer may lie in a simple fact: Philip K. Dick himself was a precog. He was not writing fiction but largely a disguised autobiography. Let us review the evidence. Like many of his classmates, Phil was expected to attend the University of California in his hometown of Berkeley in the United States, but to do grades needed to achieve the required input. This possibility began to fade quickly when, during a test of fundamental physics, Phil could not remember the key principle behind the water displacement. As 8 of the 10 questions involving this principle was clearly in trouble. And then it happened, a voice explains clearly and precisely the young surprised the scientific principles he so desperately needed to understand. All that Phil had to do was write the words in his head. Phil received a grade A. Although this voice effectively disappeared for many years, Phil continued to feel that there was a part of him that was somehow alien. Throughout the 1950s the voice was silent, and then, in a somewhat prosaic circumstances, reappeared. In an interview with his friend Greg Rickman, recorded in October 1981, Phil described how he had been watching a television program on the Galapagos turtles. Philip K. Dick with his wife Leslie Tessa Busby married from 1973 to 1977. Photo courtesy of Tessa Dick. The struggle for survival of a particular female turtle was really upset him. After laying her eggs she had turned in the wrong direction, and instead of going to the sea crawled inland. Soon the heat had caused extreme dehydration. He was dying. When he started to fade in the distance his legs yet seen moving. The film had been edited to give the impression that the dying turtle was imagining I was back in the ocean. He went to bed with this tragic image in your mind. He awoke in the night to hear a voice. In a careful and deliberate terms the company told Phil that the turtle actually believed he was in the water. I was terribly shocked and stunned to hear that voice again. It was not my own voice, because one of the phrases that the voice said was, "And she will see the sea and she shall see the sea," and I would not use the two words sea and sea in the same sentence. She tended to do that, using word choices that do not use. Once used the expression of very poisonous venom or very poisonous poison, that I would not use. Note, in the original language of Dick, the English, sea means to see and is means sea, and to pronounce a short sentence sounds like rhyme, like venom is poisonous and venom poison, and their use in a dialogue is usually avoided. It is clear that Phil recognized the voice as the same entity that had helped him in his physical exam years ago. That was back. He was continuing listening to this organization for many years, but only as a faint whisper background. In another 1981 interview, he said, "I only hear the voice of the spirit when I'm falling asleep or waking up. I have to be very receptive to hear it. It is extremely weak. It sounds like he was a million miles away." The return of the voice in February and March 1974, the voice reappeared and stayed with him. It all started innocently enough. Phil had considerable pain after having a wisdom tooth that was withdrawn. His wife, Tessa, called the dentist who prescribed painkillers. As Tessa did not want to leave her husband alone in a state of agitation, she asked if anyone could give prescription to his home in Fullerton. Half an hour later the doorbell rang and Phil ran to the door. When opening, saw a young woman holding much-needed painkillers. Phil stepped back stunned. Around the neck of the young man was a necklace with a pendant shaped like fish. Phil recognized this as a symbol of something very deep within himself. He asked what it was, and explained that it was a sign used by early Christians, as a code to display their secret beliefs to other Christians. Dick later reported, "It was the first time I experienced light pink, the same as central light in the incident Beatles described later." He said that a ray of this light shot out of the slope and entered his brain. This light opened a part of his brain that had been asleep for a long time. He described it this way: "I suddenly experienced what I later learned is called anamnesis a Greek word meaning literally loss of oblivion. I remembered who I was and where I was in a moment. In the twinkling of an eye, everything returned to my." As mentioned, until March 1974, and Dick had called the voice rarely manifested itself as the incident during school exam. But after the history of this hidden companion, Phil would become a very active part in her life. She decided that Phil had become too careless about personal appearance. She forced him to go out and buy a couple of machines for cutting nose hairs, and suggested he would cut his beard. The company had even Phil going shopping for new fashion clothes. She was also concerned about the health of the shared body. Phil was going through your medicine cabinet, and forced him to throw the drugs were proving to be problematic for your health. He discovered that the wine was too acid for sensitive stomach, and suggested she switch to beer. This being had many skills that Phil sadly lacking, such as business acumen. He realized he had made a mess of their tax affairs, and within weeks the company resolved this. Phil also fired his agent after reading about his statements, royalties and massive irregularities discovered. All these interventions were minor compared to its peak, the salvation of the life of the son of Phil. Phil describes how one morning he was in a state of semi-sleep. He heard the voice announcing that his newborn son, Christopher, had a potentially fatal birth defect, and needed urgent medical attention. In fact, the voice was very accurate in stating that, "Your child has a right inguinal hernia undiagnosed. The hydrocele is broken, and has fallen into the scrotal sac. Immediate attention is required, or will die soon." Phil said different versions of this story, including one that involved listening to the Beatles and the lyrics of Strawberry Fields. Strawberry Fields were changed to give instruction. Tessa, following the frantic instructions of her husband, took Christopher to family doctor and was, in fact, confirmed that Christopher had exactly the problem that the voice had described, and surgery was necessary. The homoplasmate Dick, what was the origin of this voice, and how he had information unknown to Phil. Phil came to the conclusion that it was an immortal part of himself, something he called a plasmate derived from plasma and mat, word partner. Argued this entity had joined with him, and in doing so, had taken human form, something that Phil called homoplasmate. He later described how his mind had been invaded by a transcendental mind, rational, as if it had been crazy all life, and I would suddenly become sane. Explained that The mental anguish was simply removed from me, as if by divine mandate. Some transcendental divine power, which was not bad, but benign, intervened to restore my mind and heal my body, and gave me a sense of beauty, joy, sanity of the world. This being freed from their shackles filled by anamnesis, and was able to use his powers to help Phil precognize the future. In fact, Phil realized that this being had been the source of a series of peculiar precognitive incidents that have occurred throughout his life. For example, in his novel Flow My Tears, the policeman said 1974, Phil has a sequence in which one of his characters, Felix Buckman, is disturbed by the death of her twin sister, Alice. He is in a service station at night and there is an unknown black man and start a conversation. In the summer of 1978, Phil strangely decided to go out late at night to send a letter. In the darkness, he realized that a man was prowling a parked car. Phil sent his letter, and returned. The man was still there. In an unusual impulse, Phil approached the man and asked him if anything happened. The man replied that he had no gasoline and had no money with him. To his surprise, Phil found himself rummaging his pocket and giving the man some cash. The man asked for the direction of Phil and said he would return later to pay. As Phil entered his apartment, realized that money could be of no use to his new friend. There were no stations within walking distance service. Phil came out, he found the man, and offered to take him to the nearby gas station. While he stood looking at the man filling his metal drum with gasoline, he had an alarming sense of recognition, like a déjà vu. Suddenly I realized that this was the scene in my novel Dash. The novel, written 8 years earlier, Station Night Gas, was exactly as I had imagined in my inner eye when I wrote the scene, the dazzling white light, accessories gas station, and now I've seen something I had not seen before in the stranger who I was helping was black. Phil led the black man back to his car, shook hands, and Phil never seen again. He finishes his description of this event with a comment a bit chilling, I was terribly moved by this experience. There was literally lived a scene completely, as it had appeared in my novel. What could explain this? See also, can the parallel universes explain the phenomenon of déjà vu? The mysterious precognition. In early 1974, Phil began a correspondence long-term with a graduate student named Gloria Bush. As time went, Gloria Phil described some of their deepest thoughts, including his fascination with his own precognitive abilities. In a letter dated May 9 of that year, he described a particularly strange Gloria recurring dream he experienced in November 1971. In dreams he always saw what appeared to be a Mexican city with square arrays of streets and yellow cabs, yellow taxis. Phil suggested a place in the United States instead of Mexico or Latin America. At the time of these dreams he was living in Marin County, north of San Francisco. In 1974 lived in Fullerton, a suburb south of Los Angeles. Right next to Fullerton is a place called Placentia, is a heavily Hispanic area. Phil tells Claudia he was convinced it was the place he saw in those dreams. But dreams of Phil in 1975 took a turn for the macabre. On February 25 he wrote a letter to Bush that was very different from those he had sent before. In a fascinating postscript to a letter from another standard mode, it mentions the company again. It is clear that had manifested in his life at that time. How often and at what intensity we cannot say. We have no other source than this letter. However, it is clear that Phil wanted to bring things to a head. He told Claudia Krenz in the letter, I was up at 5 a.m. on this last night. I did something I never did before. I sent to the entity that will stand before me, the entity that has been guiding me internally since March. Short-term sleep occurred then. Hypnagogic images of cities underwater, very nice, and then a simple scene, horribly raw, inert, yet quiet. A man lay dead on his face, in a living room between the coffee table and the couch. On May 9, 1974, he wrote another typewritten Claudia saying he felt fear letter. He did not elaborate on this review, but at the bottom of the letter is a handwritten note reads as follows, P.S. What scares me, Claudia, is that often can remember the future. Almost exactly 7 years after Phil had stopped to answer a series of phone calls to your condo. A group of neighbors then found her open front door. One witness, Mary Wilson, entered the house and describes how she initially thought no one was home, but then he saw the feet of Phil emerging from behind a coffee table. She immediately asked his mother to call Phil a close friend, the science fiction writer Tim Powers. Powers went on his motorbike to see what he could do to help. In his introduction of the selected letters of Philip K. Dick Volume 4, Powers describes what happened next. When I was putting the key in the ignition of my bike, heard the sirens of the ambulance with me down the main street. When I got home, Phil, paramedics and Mary Wilson were already there, and paramedics had lifted him from the coffee table and the couch, and took him to his bed, and Mary and I answered some medical questions hasty about him, before being placed into a stretcher and taken to the ground floor to the ambulance. Phil's dream had come true in stunning detail. He had seen the circumstances of his own death. Who, or what, was the entity that seemed to share the life of Phil and know your future? Surprisingly, Phil believed that this being was a version of himself that existed outside of time, a being who could see all of Phil's life from a position of timelessness. Phil believed in their dreams, in their state of semi-wakefulness, and during certain times of heightened awareness, this timeless part of himself could communicate and use prior knowledge to assist. In October 1977, Phil made a very curious statement in a radio interview on the radio station FMKPFA Berkeley. He described an incident that took place in 1951. Back at the time began to write science fiction. I was asleep one night and woke up, and there was a figure standing on the edge of the bed, watching me. I groaned in amazement, and suddenly, my wife woke up, and he started screaming because I could see it too. She started screaming, but I recognized him and started to reassure her, saying that I was the one who was there and who was not afraid. In the last 2 years, say that was in 1951, I dreamed almost every night I was back in the house, and had a strong feeling that at the time in 1951 or 52 I saw my future self, who had something, somehow we did not understand. I would not call it mysterious. That passed back during one of my dreams. Now that house back there, and seeing myself again, so there really are some strange things. If the figure at the end of the bed was a future version of Phil, then that version could have had prior knowledge of the experiences of life between 1951 and 1977. Phil indeed, if the interpretation of Phil can be taken literally, we hear the evidence that somehow their mind from mid-1970 was manifesting itself back into his own past. See also, A Strange Man in an Alternate Reality, Arrival in Japan, vertical verses. Whether orthogonal. But Phil was not just pleased with the acceptance that this might be the case, he wanted to create a model to explain such a belief. Immediately after the strange events of February and March 1974, or simply 302-74, as he calls them, Phil started writing a diary. Initially in the form handwritten and later as page after page of typewritten pages with diagrams and notes in the margin, this became known as his exegesis. Indeed, this was an attempt to Phil to understand the origin and meaning of the visions and revelations he continued to receive until his death in March 1983. We are fortunate that in November 2011 a single volume containing all the main sections this huge work was published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Page 976. Running this fascinating reading, and it can be discovered Phil's understanding of how a part of him could see the future. His solution was a radical reinterpretation of time itself. Phil, something called orthogonal time, proposes that there are two variations of time, both of which are at right angles to each other. We are usually aware of the vertical time, but there is another extending perpendicularly to our space-time. He called this orthogonal time. If we could perceive both times, it would cubic simultaneously, hence the cubic term. He proposed that the event is actually located within this cubic time. As such, the idea of cause and effect cannot be applied in this model. Causality can work in reverse, or act simultaneously with an event in the past or the future. In other words, within an orthogonal time they're all past and future at the moment states. See also, what if we were living in a computer simulation created by an advanced alien civilization? In exegesis, Phil make a last reference to a physical with the name of Hermann Minkowski, the master of much more famous Albert Einstein. Referring to his own precognitions, Phil wrote, "This is a new disturbing vision, but strangely coincides with my dream experiences. My premonition of events move in this way from the future. I feel that inexorably approach is not generated by this, but somehow is already there, but it is not yet visible. If they are somehow there all and find on in the universe block Minkowski, the events are all already there, but we have to find them on. Then this view could be a correct view of time and causality." Phil suggested that the basic premise of his short story adjustment team, that there is a way in which the past can be adjusted to change this may be another of her fiction of something that really is carried out. Phil believed that there is that part of us in the orthogonal time, and this alternate consciousness can, under certain circumstances, to communicate with the self of every day, which sees only linear time. This was the origin of Voice and Vala's vast active living intelligence system, vasto-active system living intelligence, the Gnostic vision of an aspect of God. This is how, in dreams, Phil met again in his own past, observing an earlier version of itself. Thus, the voice was his own voice talking about his own future. This entity created its storylines with material from their own future. As well as the encounter with the black man at the gas station ended in a scanner darkly a look in the dark, all information of all parts of our life is readily available for an open mind to receive. Phil suggested in a letter to her friend Patricia Warwick, written in September 1981, that the universe is a system of information retrieval, everything that has happened, it has ever been, every arrangement and detail, everything is stored in the present moment as information. What we lack is access, or mechanism, this stored information entry, where past each object all previous along the axis of form manifestations all this is stored in the current object, and can be recovered. This is again striking evidence that Phil seems that could access information from some form of infinite data field. This is in keeping with the work of researchers today, as Ervin Laszlo and Bernard Heisch, who suggest that this library is, in fact, something known as the zero-point field. Is this the answer to the mystery precognitions of Phil? It certainly makes sense. The future and the past are simply illusions. Philip K. Dick and H.B. Reading this article consists of two independent consciousnesses. One lives in linear time and the other in the orthogonal time. And so we can all be immortal. After all, the transition between life and death takes place in a linear, non-orthogonal, time. In his novel U-Bike, Phil created a concept known as half-life. This is a place without time, torn between life and death. Tibetan Buddhists call this the Bardo state. Is from this place where the eternal mind of Phil communicated with him. Paraphrasing the title of one of his most interesting books, Time is Out of Joint, Time is Disjointed. Could it be that we all exist in a place where time is disjointed?